The papers were signed. The time was set. All that was left was the formality of watching him stop breathing. No one in that hospital was rooting for Joe Young. Room 9002 had become a waiting room, not for recovery, but for inheritance. The men in expensive suits who passed through its doors didn't come to check his pulse. They came to confirm that the most feared name in the city was finally, permanently silent. Joe Young had built his empire the way others built cathedrals, slowly, ruthlessly, with the kind of devotion that left bodies in the foundation. For 2 decades, he had been the unseen hand behind the city's darkest machinery. Shipping lanes, political favors, the kind of fear that didn't need a face. Then his own inner circle put 3 inches of steel between his ribs at a dinner he had hosted himself. Now he lay in a medically induced nowhere, not quite dead, not meaningfully alive, while his associates carved his legacy into portions small enough to pocket. The doctors had a word for his condition, his lawyers had paperwork for it, his second-in-command, Marcus UN, had a timeline, 48 hours before the life support was reclassified as an obstacle rather than a lifeline. The city's most feared man had been reduced to a countdown. Nobody mourned, nobody lingered. The guards outside his door were there to protect assets, not a person, and the only flowers in the room were white lilies that Marcus himself had sent, the kind you bring to a funeral you arranged. But every night, long after the last specialist had gone home and the corridor outside had gone quiet, the service elevator on the east wing would open, and out would come a woman with a mop, a cart, and absolutely no idea she was walking into the most consequential room of her life. Her name was Lena Okafor, night shift cleaning staff, badge number 4471. To the hospital, she was a function, a pair of hands that kept the floors sanitary and the bins empty. To the city, she was invisible, which was the polite way of saying the city had never once thought about her at all. She was raising her daughter, Gift, alone, on a salary that assumed she had no emergencies and made no room for the ones she did. She ate last, she slept less. She carried the particular exhaustion of a woman who had learned that rest was a luxury other people's lives were built around. She had been cleaning room 9002 for 3 weeks, and somewhere in that first week, without quite deciding to, she had started talking. Not because she knew who he was. She didn't, not really. She had heard rumors the way everyone had, the kind of rumors that lived in whispers and never attached themselves to a face. But the man in that bed had no face worth fearing. He had a slack jaw and chapped lips and a hospital gown that swallowed his shoulders and tattoos that crawled up his forearm to disappear beneath the white sheet like the last evidence of a life he could no longer claim. He looked, more than anything, like someone who had been left. So Lena talked to him the way she talked to Gift when the apartment felt too quiet. Not to fill silence, but because silence, after a certain point, starts to feel like giving up. She told him about the broken radiator that had been broken since the first cold snap and the landlord who had stopped pretending he would fix it. She told him about Gift's fever last Tuesday and how she had sat on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning pressing a damp cloth to her daughter's forehead and bargaining with a god she wasn't sure was listening. She told him about the moon, how Gift had discovered it 3 months ago, really discovered it, the way children discover things, with their whole body, and had taken to pressing her nose against their apartment window every night to find it. "There it is, Mama! It followed us home again." Joe Young heard none of it consciously, but somewhere in the locked and lightless architecture of his mind, something had begun, almost imperceptibly, to stir, the way an ember stirs when someone nearby is still breathing. He had not chosen to hold on, but something was holding him anyway, and in 4 days, a child with a fever and nowhere to sleep would walk through that door, and the countdown would stop being about death entirely. Marcus Ewan signed the form at 6:14 a.m. using the same pen Joe Young had gifted him 7 years ago, a matte black Mont Blanc with his initials pressed into the clip. A small cruelty that, the kind Marcus had always been good at. He pressed the nib to the paper with the unhurried confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment long enough that it no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like administration. The form was titled Withdrawal of Extraordinary Measures, 12 pages, witnessed by 2 physicians and a hospital attorney who had been retained and paid by Marcus himself. Joe Young had no family to contest it, no wife, no children, no one whose grief was legally inconvenient. That had always been his greatest vulnerability, though he had spent 20 years mistaking it for strength. Marcus capped the pen and slid the folder across the desk without looking at the doctor sitting opposite him. 48 hours, he said. Keep it clean. What the paperwork didn't mention, what no paperwork ever would, was the electrician from a private contractor who had already been cleared for access to the hospital's east wing. Scheduled maintenance on the backup power grid, 3rd floor. Routine. Undocumented. The kind of work order that existed only long enough to get a man through a security checkpoint and would be scrubbed from the system before anyone thought to look. A power surge to room 9002 would read as an equipment malfunction. It happened in hospitals. Tragic, but not suspicious, especially not when the patient was already on the wrong side of every medical opinion in the building. Marcus had learned, over 2 decades at Joe Young's side, that the most effective moves were the ones that looked like accidents. Joe Young himself had taught him that. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He simply didn't care. He stood at the window of the administrative office and looked out over the city still gray with early morning. Somewhere below, Joe Young's shipping routes were already running under new authorization. 3 of his warehouses had been quietly retitled. The accounts that Marcus had spent 4 months carefully siphoning were now sitting in a holding structure that had nothing to do with the syndicate and everything to do with Marcus Ewan's private future. The city didn't know yet. It would soon. And when it did, it would not mourn. It would simply reorganize itself around a new name, the way it always had, the way cities do. Marcus picked up his phone and sent a single message to the contractor. Thursday, 3 a.m. Don't be late. Then he straightened his jacket, picked up his coffee, and walked back toward the elevator, passing room 9002 without stopping, without slowing, without so much as a glance through the narrow window in the door. Inside, the machines kept beeping, and Lena's cart sat in the corner, waiting for midnight. She came in at 12:47 a.m., same as always. The corridor outside room 9002 was empty at that hour. The guards on rotation had developed the habit of looking through Lena rather than at her, which suited her fine. She had learned early that invisibility, when you couldn't afford anything better, could be worn like armor. She badged in, wheeled her cart through the door, and let the soft, mechanical click of the latch closing behind her settle the room back into quiet. She didn't turn the overhead light on. She never did. The monitors provided enough, a cold blue glow that made everything look like the bottom of something deep. She moved through it the way she moved through most of her life, carefully, without disturbing anything that didn't need disturbing. She was halfway through wiping down the side counter when she started talking. It wasn't a decision, it never was. It was more like pressure releasing. The way a kettle doesn't choose to whistle, it simply reaches the point where silence is no longer an option. The radiator went out again, she said, wringing the cloth over the small basin. 3rd time this month. I stuffed a towel under the door to keep the cold out, but Gift still woke up at 2 in the morning asking why the apartment smelled like outside. She paused, folding the cloth into quarters. I didn't have a good answer for that. Joe Young did not move. His chest rose and fell in the shallow, mechanical rhythm the ventilator assigned him, patient, indifferent, keeping its own kind of time. Lena kept going. She told him about the morning 2 days ago when Gift had refused to wear her coat because the color was wrong, too yellow, she'd said, with the uncompromising aesthetic conviction of a 5-year-old, and Lena had stood in their doorway for 4 full minutes negotiating with a child who had inherited her father's stubbornness and none of his charm. She laughed softly at the memory, the kind of laugh that lives close to the chest. She won, Lena admitted, obviously. She moved to the window and wiped the sill down in slow strokes, looking out at the city without really seeing it. She found the moon again last night. Different window this time, the bathroom one. She climbed onto the toilet to reach it. A pause. I should have been annoyed. I wasn't. The monitor beside the bed shifted almost imperceptibly, a single variation in the readout, there and gone so quickly it could have been interference. It wasn't. Deep in the locked silence of his mind, something had learned the rhythm of her arrivals, the way the body learns to anticipate morning. Not consciously, not with language, but with something older than both. Her voice had become the one frequency that cut through the static. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew the shape of her presence the way the drowning know the surface. He was still rising toward it. Marcus came at noon, when the floor was busy enough that his presence read as courtesy rather than calculation. He dressed for it. Charcoal suit, no tie, the particular expression of a man carrying quiet grief. He had practiced it the same way he practiced everything, in front of a mirror, at sufficient length, until it stopped feeling like performance and started feeling like personality. The nurses at the station watched him pass with the soft deference people extend to the bereaved, and Marcus accepted it with a small, grateful nod that he had also practiced. He carried white lilies. A full arrangement, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a cord, the kind of flowers that existed in the precise territory between sympathy and goodbye. He had chosen them deliberately, the way Marcus chose everything. White for mourning, lilies because Yo Young had once, at a burial they had attended together 15 years ago, said he found them grotesque. They smell like an apology, he'd said, watching them lower the casket, and nobody means it. Marcus remembered everything Yo Young had ever said. It was, perhaps, the most honest form of respect he'd ever shown the man. He set the arrangement on the windowsill without ceremony and stood at the foot of the bed with his hands clasped, looking down at what remained of the most dangerous man he had ever known. The ventilator breathed for him in its slow, borrowed rhythm. The monitors maintained their indifferent vigil. Yo Young's face was still, not peaceful exactly, but evacuated, like a building after everyone has gone. You always said sentiment was a liability, Marcus said quietly. His voice was level, conversational, the tone of a man finishing an old argument. Turns out you were right. Look where yours got you. He tilted his head slightly, studying the tattoos that crawled up the slack arm. That ink had taken years. Marcus knew the stories behind most of it, the ones Yo Young had told and the ones he hadn't needed to. Each marking was a record of something survived, a taxonomy of a life built entirely on the premise that softness was a wound waiting to happen. And yet, Marcus's gaze moved to the chair in the corner, the one that had been shifted, slightly, imperceptibly, from where the cleaning staff usually left it. He noticed because noticing small displacements was how he had stayed alive in Yo Young's world. Someone had been sitting there, regularly by the look of it. He filed it away without reacting. Thursday, he said, almost gently, as if offering the information as a kindness. You won't feel anything. I made sure of that much. He straightened, smoothed the front of his jacket, and walked out without looking back, leaving the lilies on the windowsill, white and deliberate and faintly obscene in the blue monitor light. The smell of them filled the room long after he was gone. Lena would notice it at midnight and open the window without knowing why.
The call came at 4 p.m., while Lena was folding laundry on the floor because the table had become a surface for things she hadn't had time to deal with yet. Her supervisor's voice was the kind of flat that people use when they've decided to feel nothing about what they're doing. Budget restructuring, position elimination. Her access badge would be deactivated at midnight. There was a formal letter if she wanted it. Lena said she didn't and hung up before the silence on the other end could become something she'd have to respond to. She sat with it for exactly 4 minutes. Then Gift called from the bedroom. The fever had been building since morning, that particular heat that radiates off a child's skin like something trapped and trying to escape. Lena had told herself it was manageable. She had told herself that the way she told herself most things lately, with the determined, forward-facing certainty of someone who cannot afford to consider the alternative. By 8 o'clock, Gift was shaking. By 9, the landlord's message arrived. 3 months of deferred warnings collapsed into a single paragraph. 30 days, it said, but the tone said sooner. Lena read it once, put her phone face down on the floor, and pressed her forehead against Gift while her daughter slept in fitful, burning increments. The heating had been dead since Tuesday. She packed what mattered in under 20 minutes, the practiced efficiency of someone who had always kept one part of her mind near the door. Gift's medication, 2 changes of clothes, the photograph she kept in the inner pocket of her coat, not because she looked at it often, but because leaving it would have felt like a different kind of loss. She wrapped Gift in both their blankets and carried her down 4 flights of stairs in the dark because the elevator had been unreliable since October, and tonight was not a night for unreliable things. Outside, the cold was immediate and serious. Lena walked. She didn't let herself think past the next block and then the next, which was how she had learned to survive distances that would break you if you measured them all at once. Gift's head rested against her shoulder, damp with fever, her small breath visible in the frozen air. The hospital appeared the way it always had, overlit, indifferent, permanent. Lena knew every service entrance. She knew which camera on the East Wing ran a 3-minute lag. She knew that the guard rotation at 12:40 a.m. left a 90-second window at the loading dock that nobody had ever thought to close because nobody they were guarding against had ever been a woman carrying a sick child and a duffel bag. She was through it in 40 seconds. The service elevator. 4th floor. The corridor that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Room 9002. She stood at the door with Gift burning against her chest and her badge that no longer worked and nowhere left to go, and she pressed it to the reader anyway. The door clicked open. The override she hadn't known was still active. She went inside.
She didn't plan it. That was the thing she would never be able to fully explain afterward. Not to the doctors, not to herself, not to anyone who needed the moment to make logical sense. There was no reasoning behind it, no calculated risk assessment, no decision in any form that the word decision usually implies. There was only Gift, shaking so badly now that Lena's arms were shaking with her, and the room that was warm, and the bed that was wide, and a mother who had run completely out of options and was operating on something older and more desperate than thought. She laid Gift down on the only surface that made sense. The left side of the bed was narrow but sufficient. She arranged her daughter carefully, the way she always did, one hand behind the small head, the other guiding her down with the practiced tenderness of someone who had performed this ritual 10,000 times in rooms far less quiet than this one. Gift whimpered softly and turned instinctively toward warmth, the way children do, the way all small things do, toward Jo Young's chest. She settled there with her cheek pressed flat against the white hospital gown, her tiny fist curling against the fabric, her fevered body finding the one position it wanted and going still. Lena stood at the bedside with her hands at her sides and watched, and breathed, and didn't move. The monitors continued their vigil. Somewhere in the hospital's lower floors, the city kept its own hours.
In room 9002, the only sound was the ventilator and the beeping and the soft, fractured breathing of a sick child who had finally stopped fighting the fever long enough to rest. Then something changed. It was not dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It arrived the way most profound things arrive, quietly, almost apologetically, as though uncertain of its welcome. The EEG readout, which had flatlined for 19 days with the mechanical certainty of a fact everyone had accepted, flickered. Once, then again. Then it began to move. Not wildly, not with the explosive urgency of movie resurrections. It moved the way a tide moves, gradually, irresistibly, as though it had always been coming and simply needed something to come back for. The lines that had been flat began to climb in small, tentative peaks, each one slightly more certain than the last. Inside the shuttered architecture of Joe Young's mind, something was happening that no physician in Meridian General would be able to fully account for in their notes. A frequency had broken through, not a voice this time, but a heartbeat, small, fast, slightly irregular with fever, pressed directly against the place in his chest where his own heart had been beating alone for 19 days. It was the most alive sound he had ever heard. And somewhere beneath 19 days of silence, behind every wall he had ever built, Joe Young moved toward it the way a man moves toward light when he has been long enough in the dark. His fingers closed slowly around the bedrail. He was coming back.
The night nurse noticed the EEG at 1:23 a.m. She stood at the monitoring station down the hall, processing the readout with the particular stillness of someone whose brain is receiving information it doesn't yet have a category for. Then she was moving, pulling her radio, her voice tight and controlled, calling for the attending on call with the clipped precision of someone who'd trained for extraordinary moments and was only now discovering that training and experiencing were entirely different things. Within 4 minutes, room 9002 had 3 people in it. Within 6, it had 7. They came in fast and purposeful, the way medical teams do, all efficiency and urgency and the brisk choreography of people who knew their roles. The attending reached the bedside first, registered the EEG with wide eyes, and then registered the child, and the 2 facts arrived in his mind in the wrong order, which briefly made neither of them make sense. "There's a child in the bed," someone said, which was accurate but insufficient. "Get her out," the attending said. "Carefully, don't disturb the patient. We don't know what we're—" The nurse nearest the bed reached for Gift. Gift stirred at the unfamiliar hands, her fever-blurred mind interpreting the contact the way sick children interpret most disturbances, as threat. She made a sound, low and distressed, and pressed herself harder against Joe Young's chest with the blind, unreasoning insistence of something that has found the one warm thing in a cold world and will not be moved from it. The nurse tried again, more firmly. What happened next silenced the room entirely. The arm came up, not slowly, not with the tentative, trembling effort of a man returning from 19 days of unconsciousness. It came up with a directness that belonged to a different kind of man entirely, certain, immediate, deliberate. The tattooed hand closed around the bedrail with a grip that whitened the knuckles, and Joe Young's body turned, fractionally but unmistakably, so that his shoulder angled between Gift and the nurse reaching for her. Nobody spoke. The attending physician stood at the foot of the bed with his penlight still uncapped in his hand and said nothing because there was nothing in his training that had prepared him for the specific atmosphere that had just entered the room. It wasn't the movement itself. Patients regained motor function. It was the quality of it, the intention behind it, the way every person in that room had simultaneously understood, without being told, that what they were looking at was not a medical event. It was a warning. Joe Young's eyes did not open. His face did not change. The ventilator still breathed for him in its steady, borrowed rhythm, but his hand remained locked around that rail, and Gift remained pressed against Joe Young's chest, and the nurse who had reached for her had taken one full step back without deciding to. The EEG climbed steadily in the background.
Nobody reached for the child again.
He opened his eyes fully for the first time on the morning of the third day. Not with drama, not with the gasping, disoriented urgency that the medical team had been quietly bracing for. He simply opened them, the way a man opens his eyes when he has decided he is done sleeping, and looked at the ceiling of room 9002 with the steady, assessing focus of someone taking inventory of a situation before committing to a response. The attending physician was summoned, tests were run. The ventilator was carefully, incrementally reduced as his lungs remembered their original purpose. By evening, it had been removed entirely, though a nurse remained posted outside the door with instructions to check vitals every 20 minutes, because nothing about Joe Young's recovery was following the trajectory they had prepared for, and everyone in the department had quietly agreed to stay alert. He did not speak to the doctors. He watched them with dark, patient eyes and submitted to their examinations with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that the most effective way to observe a room is to give it nothing to react to. When they left, he turned his head toward the window and lay quietly with whatever he was thinking, which was, by all appearances, considerable. What the medical team did not know, what nobody knew, was that Joe Young had been awake in the meaningful sense for longer than his chart reflected, and in that time, with the particular resourcefulness of a man who had spent 20 years operating in the spaces between what was visible and what was actually happening, he had communicated. A night shift orderly named Choi, who had worked the East Wing for 11 years and owed Joe Young a debt that predated his employment at Meridian General, had noticed the change before the monitors announced it. He had come in quietly, asked no questions, and left a phone taped beneath the bedside table where the cleaning cart usually rested. Joe Young had retrieved it at 4 a.m., when the floor was at its most empty. He made 4 calls, sent 9 messages. The calls were short and precise, the kind of communication that assumed the listener's competence and wasted nothing on explanation. By 6 a.m., 3 things had been set in motion that would take the rest of the city several weeks to fully understand. Lena O'Coffer's debt, medical, rental, the 2 credit accounts that had been quietly compounding interest for 4 years, was cleared before sunrise. Not restructured, not deferred, cleared with the kind of finality that left no record worth contesting. The building on Sutter Lane where Lena rented her 4th-floor apartment was purchased outright by a holding company that did not yet exist before midnight and was fully registered by morning. The current landlord accepted the offer within 6 minutes of receiving it, because the alternative had been communicated clearly enough that no elaboration was necessary. A letter was drafted, unsigned, unadorned, and placed in Lena's building mailbox by 7 a.m. It contained 4 words and a set of keys. Debts must be paid. They came on Thursday at 3 a.m., as scheduled. 2 of them, which was either a professional courtesy or an underestimation, and given who they were dealing with, it was almost certainly the latter. They moved through the East Wing with the practiced invisibility of men who had done this kind of work in places with far more security than a hospital corridor at the dead hour of the night. The power grid fluctuation that Marcus Ewan had arranged had knocked out the cameras on the 4th floor at 2:47 a.m., right on schedule. The guard rotation had been accounted for. The contractor had been thorough. What the contractor had not accounted for was that Joe Young had been expecting them since Tuesday. The first man through the door of room 9002 stopped so abruptly that the second walked into him. Joe Young was sitting upright, not propped, not assisted, sitting with the unhurried, self-possessed verticality of a man who had chosen his position deliberately and saw no reason to adjust it. The ventilator was gone. The monitors had been switched to silent at some point during the night. He was wearing the hospital gown still, which under different circumstances might have undermined the effect, but did not, because the effect was not generated by what he was wearing. It was generated by his eyes.
He looked at the two men in his doorway with an expression so completely devoid of surprise that it recontextualized their entrance entirely. They were not intruders who had caught him vulnerable. They were guests who had arrived exactly when he expected and were already, in every way that mattered, behind. His right hand rested on the bedrail. His left rested on Gift's back. She was asleep against his side, her fever broken now, her breathing the slow and even breathing of a child who had decided the world was safe enough to rest in. One small fist was curled against his ribs. Her face, in sleep, was entirely untroubled. Neither man moved. Joe Young let the silence sit for a moment, the way a man sits with a card he has no need to play quickly. Then he spoke. His voice was low, rough from 19 days of disuse, but unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. "I know who sent you," he said. "I know what he promised you. I know the account the first payment came from and the name it was filed under." He paused, and something moved behind his eyes that was not anger exactly. It was older than anger, and considerably more dangerous. "I also know every person Marcus Ewan has ever loved, every business, every asset, every carefully constructed thing he believes I don't know about." He looked at them with absolute calm. "Wake her, and I burn all of it, every last thing, down to the foundation." Gift shifted slightly in her sleep, murmured something soft and wordless, and settled again. The two men left without speaking. By dawn, Marcus Ewan's phone was ringing, and for the first time in his life, he did not answer it.
6 months later, Joe Young watched Gift chase a paper boat down the edge of the Meridian River and understood, in the way you understand things that arrive without announcement, that this was the most powerful he had ever felt in his life. It was not a feeling he had vocabulary for. The language he had spent 20 years building was a language of leverage and consequence, of debts and their collection, of power expressed through the controlled application of fear. It was a precise and functional language. It had built him an empire. It had also, he now understood, described a life lived entirely on the outside of something he couldn't have named then and could only partially name now. Gift reached the paper boat before it escaped into the current and retrieved it with both hands, triumphant, her boots darkened with river water that Lena would notice and say nothing about because she had learned, in the way Lena learned most things, to choose her battles wisely. "It didn't sink," Gift announced, to no one and everyone. "No," Joe Young agreed, "it didn't." He was sitting on a bench at the river's edge, unremarkable in a dark coat, no guards visible, though they were there, repositioned and retrained in the 6 months since Meridian General, operating now according to a different set of priorities: protection rather than intimidation, presence rather than threat. It was a distinction that had required considerable renegotiation with men who had been hired for an entirely different kind of work, and some of them had not stayed. That was fine. The ones who remained were better for the pruning. His empire, in its original form, was gone, dismantled with the same deliberateness with which it had been built, over the course of 4 months, through a series of transactions and dissolutions that his former associates had watched with the bewildered outrage of people witnessing something they lacked the framework to interpret. Men like Joe Young did not walk away. They were removed or they died. The voluntary relinquishment of power was not a concept his world had a word for. He had made his own word for it. The foundation had been Lena's idea, though she hadn't known she was having it. She had said one night in the hospital when Gift was sleeping and the city was doing its late-night accounting outside the window that the hardest thing about being invisible was that the systems designed to help you had been built by people who had never once had to use them. Joe Young had listened with the full, unhurried attention he had previously reserved only for threats. Then he had built something different. Lena sat beside him now on the bench, her hands wrapped around a coffee that was going cold because Gift kept requiring her attention, which was most of the time. She was watching her daughter with the particular expression of someone who has survived enough to understand what surviving is worth. She didn't know the full extent of what Joe Young had done and undone on her behalf. She knew enough. She had decided, with characteristic practicality, that the rest was a conversation for a day when Gift wasn't ankle-deep in a river.
Gift held the paper boat up against the sky, examining it against the light. Joe Young watched her and felt something in his chest that his old language had no word for either. He was working on a new one.
Joe Young started with an empire and ended with something stronger, a reason. Some things can't be built with money or fear. They can only be given to you by a child who doesn't know any better, pressing her small face against your chest and deciding, without asking, that you're worth saving. He was, and so is this story. If it hit, like, share, and subscribe. New chapters drop regularly, and you don't want to walk in late on a story like this one. See you next time.